So I oftentimes refer to myself as an anthropologist because I think it's a good foundation for everything. So I typically say like I'm an anthropologist who works in user experience and product management when it's a work context. If it's more sort of for some of my hobbies, I might say I'm an anthropologist who produces music and visual art.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Jagged with Just Ravi, Conversations at the Edge with thought leaders from the branding, marketing, and the business world. Hi, Matt. It's great to have you on my show.
Thanks, Just Ravi. Appreciate you having me on.
How anthropology helps uncover hidden insights. If you could take an example, perhaps of the art app that you have, designed recently, and how without anthropology that would not happen. So people can appreciate that that kind of disruptive creativity, which is effective and which is a solution, can come if there is a deeper understanding, which something like an anthropology can only give.
Yeah, sure. So, first let me preface and say two things or a few things. So one, while I do think anthropology is incredibly valid, important, and having an anthropologist on the team is a very worthwhile endeavor, something I would suggest to everybody if you can support a big enough team. I would also suggest that you have, an interdisciplinary team made up of other human scientists, people who study behavioral economics, psychology, sociology, whatever it may be, right? They all have value, and us working together always produces richer insights than only one discipline. And that also goes for obviously having people trained in business, people trained in technology, right? All of us, and design, of course, all of us coming together produce better products, produce better marketing messages or marketing campaigns, can design organizational, cultures better, understand them and design them better. And so it's, while I support anthropology, I just want to say that I think teams are better than even just one discipline. Having said that, I think there's two kind of critical things here that underride why, we have the explanatory power that we do. One is the method of ethnography, right? So it helps you find unknown unknowns, I like to say, because if you go out and you observe and you see something, you experience it with your own eyes and then can include that in your findings. Whereas if you imagine you just prepare a survey, you're preparing it from only the information you know to date. And I appreciate that a lot of surveys have open-ended questions, but those open-ended questions don't always those open-ended portions still may miss some topic completely, right? You still may not even think to ask the leading question from some topic that you just don't even know exists, the unknown unknowns. So if you produce a research instrument like a survey, you're only limited, what can get in there in terms of questions is limited to your knowledge. And the sort of adjacent tangential open-ended responses that you get back are still typically limited, or tied to what you ask in the first place. So by observing, in the first place, we uncover things that you wouldn't uncover with other methods. And then second, we oftentimes are able to give meaning to data in a way that, say, big data may not be able to. So I, again, support data science. I think it should be part of the team, but data science gives you signals as to something that is happening. It doesn't tell you why in the most simplistic sort of explanation. If you go out, if you see something is happening in a product, on a website, whatever it may be, and you know that, X people are bailing out of like a sign-up process at this point, but you don't know why they are. If you observe them, if you talk to them, you can give meaning to that, right? And so for those reasons, the method of ethnography, observation and, semi-structured interviewing gives us some explanatory power. And then second, we back that up with social theory. Now, that is not to say that you need social theory to understand every little thing. But if you want to get into some kind of like innovation work where you're going to create something new, you're going to go into a new space, you're going to radically disrupt, your sort of an industry, you're going to need to have a deeper understanding. And so to tie that back to the example that, you suggested with the art app. So we wanted to get into the art market. Upon doing research, some of the things we realized is that the art market is incredibly finicky in terms of issues of diversity, inclusion. The way you become popular is not a very objective or rational sort of approach, like econ might want us to think, right? It's very much a subjective industry. If somebody who's popular, like say if there's a popular gallery in Soho, New York, who for some reason likes your art, and you've never had an art show, say, before, but for some reason they see you, they like say that you know them personally and they like your art and they bring you in. You might not have any career previously in the art world, but you may have just made it because like a significant gallery has just sort of waved their wand to say that, you're worth showing in this brand name gallery, if you will, this blue chip gallery. And from there, you might have an art career. Yeah. Whereas somebody who doesn't have those kind of connections to get into such a gallery might be producing wonderful art, like might be trained, in classic sort of historical skill sets, be producing like, perfect impressionism or perfect realism or whatever it may be, just some style that's not trendy today. And despite their immense skill level at those styles, may simply never make it and might not even be able to make a living off of their art. And so the other factor here is, algorithms play a role. So if you think of, if you were to upload your art into any of the big platforms, right? It more or less it's going to come down to an algorithm, and does the algorithm produce your art in the search results? This also applies to books on Amazon. It applies to music on Spotify, movies on Netflix, you name it, right? All these sort of cultural markets. If you don't have name recognition offline, people coming to you, typically the algorithm doesn't really see that there's any interest in you. And then if it's never liked, if it's never put on playlists, if it's never shared, all those kind of like signals to an algorithm. If none of that happens, then you don't really get promoted within these algorithms, and you just like offline, you're languishing in the shadows online. And so what we realized is to bring it back to anthropology. So those insights got kind of supercharged by theory from the social sciences. So there's theories of economic, social, and cultural capital. And so by using that theory to make sense of these problems that happen, and that's kind of to say that if you have money, you can almost pay to become popular. If you have like social relationships, you can get into that gallery in Soho. If you've been able to go to like if you've for some reason been able to go to certain elite institutions, right, and have like sort of certain credentials on like the cultural side, you might be deemed, sort of in the in crowd, right? There's various ways that you can increase your popularity offline, which then has a tendency to trickle over into the digital world and increase your popularity within algorithms. But if you don't have any of that, you generally struggle, and you may not make a living, both off in the physical space and on today online in digital markets. So the question is how can we disrupt that? And that's what we're working on. And so we're using the insights from the ethnography and then the social theory to make sense of that, to inform a strategy, really a business strategy that differentiates from all the other players in the market, which then in turn informs the product vision and ultimately the product requirements, and then the product, and the UX ultimately, right? And so from that research powered by social theory, we are then using it to produce sort of all of those outcomes.
Matt, is there a reason why anthropology is again becoming so popular? Is there a reason why we need to, had we stopped looking at the deeper context of things, are we becoming too clinical in how we are using technology? Why is it that the more technology is trying to invade and take over our lives, the more, there's emphasis on, let's not forget we are human beings. Let's not forget that these are our drives and needs.
So, I agree with you that, broadly speaking, UX is on the rise. At this point, I've never, in all the years I've been involved, in the past 7 or so years, I've never seen it this hot. It's now actually, incredibly difficult market to get into. Within that, there's a big push to hire social scientists, especially from big companies, who have the budget to build out really robust, mature teams. And I think the reason why is we're realizing that a lot of the products we've built over the past, for a very long period of time, but it's, in recent history, especially in the digital world, have had a lot of unintended consequences that are not particularly productive for society. But also there's things outside of the tech space that are happening that we just didn't see coming, right? So there is, the rise of nationalism and certain people being elected to offices that the sort of quote unquote establishment just never saw coming in numerous countries, of course, including the US. There are products, that police are using that are reinforcing existing patterns of racism. There are, just issues of bias in lots of algorithms that are having a real big impact. The engagement model of Facebook, say, right, has a tendency to promote content that performs well in terms of, what it deems to perform well, which is essentially reactions, likes, regardless of if that content is ethical, moral, which I appreciate in its own right. Those are culturally mediated concepts, culturally constructed concepts. But, it produces this content, which quite frankly, a lot of times is harmful, which is outright violent. And, I'll give you so on Facebook, I actually have an advertising account that's been shut down because I was advertising my TED Talk, my DNA TED Talk, and my music. And yet you have people who are advertising content, related to hate. And somehow the algorithm allows it to go by because it's within those sort of bubbles of the people it's being shown to. It gets lots of positive reactions. Whereas like maybe my TED Talk challenging, like, some of the questionable aspects of DNA tests was, maybe some people in the science community didn't like that I was challenging, right? And so you have like this very unequal application based on machine learning that, doesn't even make sense in a lot of cases and has quite harmful, in the case of the way it's impacting democracy in a number of countries, can be quite harmful to the long-term stability of the world. Thankfully, some companies are looking around and trying to figure out how can we make these more, more humanistic, and arguably not just humanistic, but just for really the whole planet. And what that means in terms of not just all living creatures, but literally like,
environment and nature. Yeah. Like you talked about, Matt, DNA testing. So could you talk, taking that role of anthropology in understanding future possibilities or future change? Can anthropology play a good role there as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. It's a great one because actually, I didn't say it earlier, but in design anthropology, we're very often focused on the future, right? It's a very much, when people think of anthropology, oftentimes they think of, like in the US, they think of like Indiana Jones, the hat going off, kind of finding artifacts. And probably in many other places around the world, actually what they think of is people from sort of the global north coming and stealing their artifacts almost, right? In India, anthropologists were used by colonial, Britain to basically understand and ultimately subject, people, right? And so there's actually a lot of negative connotations with the history of anthropology, and historically, and that discipline of anthropology, like basic, true kind of classic culture anthropology, was in many ways very focused on like understanding, the past. And at least back then in the colonial days, sort of like objectifying in the present. And while we have to understand the past in design anthropology, we're very much also focused on trying to make positive change into the future. And so, with my DNA research, I was conducting research to sort of understand why people took these like broader questions. I mean, I was doing some product and UX work within that space, but also very much interested in broader questions. Why do people take these tests in the first place? Do they understand some of the, do they understand some of the security or privacy issues with these tests? What do these tests do to give them meaning in their life once they've taken it, right? How does it help them understand their own identities? To that point, is there value to these tests, right? Are we from a health perspective, arguably we're a little early. They don't provide for most people, they don't provide a lot of value yet because they don't do a great job. We just don't understand multigenic conditions enough yet.
Okay.
If it's a rare disease single trait test, great. But so it doesn't provide a lot of value. So why do people that take these tests, do they understand it? Do they understand what they're giving up? And if not, what do we need to do to protect consumers in the end and not just turn over people's data and empower companies to make money off of it?
Right. My God, this is really fascinating. I mean, the kind of questions one can ask with the understanding. I mean, I think that's the entire power, no? The understanding informs your questions, and you can ask the right questions, and that kind of directs you, if perhaps in the right direction for the right kind of design, research, and decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to say a brief bit on that, there's a lot of confusion about our methods in general. People who are trained in the scientific method, who are just in a very sort of, there's in the US at least, there's the big quant versus qual argument always, right?
Classic.
And right, it's always been going on, and there's, to a degree, then you can make the argument that what there's really going on is there's almost like a deductive versus inductive argument going on about the way we think about the problem space and approach it. And in the classic sort of deductive, you basically have your hypothesis and you're trying to prove, kind of disprove. We start from the perspective that we don't know anything. We're like, babies in the environment, and we want those other humans to show us, to tell us, through, observation interviews, what's happening, so that we can slowly start to make sense of it. And at some point we might get to something that we want to sort of prove, disprove, and maybe go kind of in more of a deductive process. And maybe then we might generate like a survey instrument to go out and validate something, right? We take mixed methods approaches, but we start with the idea that we don't know anything and we let the others tell us, versus assuming we know the answer.
Your 3 a.m. friend.
You said 3 a.m. friend? Well, my wife.
Okay, nice. Okay. If you didn't have to sleep, what would you do with that time?
Produce music.
Oh, okay. If you could be any animal, what would that be and why?
I've always liked chimps. I think chimps are very fun and creative.
Primates, you've studied them as well. Okay. What would you do on Mars for fun?
There's not much to do, so probably sit back and listen to music. Observe what's floating around you.
Suits you fine, right? Okay. One thing no one knows about you.
Until recently that I produced music. I'm just starting to release it. That was something I did for a decade and nobody knew.
Oh, okay. Preferred food cuisine?
Thai food.
A book you'd like to gift to all your friends?
So there's a new book that just came out by Gillian Tett, one of the lead editorial people at the Financial Times. She just wrote a book called Anthrovision. It distills a lot of the concepts we talked about today in a very sort of easy to read way. So I would suggest it to everybody.
Okay. What would you tell your 18-year-old self?
You're stupid. What are you doing?
Matt, could you share with our audiences your online addresses? Where can they find you?
Sure. Well, thanks for asking. So you can find me at mattartz.me, mattartz.me. You can also then, if you just search Matt Artz or Matt Artz Anthropologist in Google, you'll find all kinds of things. You'll find LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, not Facebook, but you'll find, Spotify, Apple Music, you name it. Yeah, so no, I would certainly suggest listening to The Jagged with Just Ravi. It's a great show. You're doing wonderful work. You've had some really nice interviews. It's a big contribution to the broader discourse of what we're doing in the business world.